Okay, so today I want to talk about the connection between John D. Rockefeller, born in the 1800s, who was the owner of a shipping company, Standard Oil, and who also created, with the help of Reverend Frederick Gates, a trust for a medical establishment. These two books that I'm using today, the first one is The Laws of Human Nature by Robert Greene, and it talks about Rockefeller's personality, which he calls an aggressive personality, which if you go back to Carl Jung's writings, he would call them archetypes, that Rockefeller's archetype would be the aggressive archetype. And Carl Jung describes the archetypes as the way a person's brought up. So Rockefeller Medicine Man tells us about the trust that he created with Reverend Gates. And from his relationship with Reverend Gates and John D. Rockefeller, we get to Nelson Rockefeller. And these three are also then related to Bill Gates, the Gates we have now. So Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller, is an interesting man to read about. He did a lot of things. He owned Standard Oil. Just after the Civil War, he owned a shipping company or a merchandising company before the Civil War, and then he also created this medical trust, which they called philanthropy. But when you really read about what they were doing, you find that it was less about philanthropy and more about money and monopolies. So there's a connection here between John D. Rockefeller and our current Bill Gates and the Reverend Frederick Gates, who created Rockefeller's medicine trust. And the medicine trust is what now we know as the medical establishment. So to understand Rockefeller's personality and why he was aggressive, we have to go back to how he was raised. His father was called many things, among them a con artist, a snake oil salesman, a drunkard. He was married to two women at the same time. He was violent. He would leave home and come back and bring money and gifts and then get drunk and be violent towards everyone. So the money that he would bring back, the mom had to figure out how to make it last until he came back again, which could be months or a year later. So to understand his personality helps us understand why he did the things that he did. So Rockefeller's personality in The Laws of Human Nature, described by Robert Greene, is an aggressive type, and he couldn't stand to lose anything. So when he was in his horse and carriage riding along the street and someone started passing him up, maybe they didn't even know it was Rockefeller, or they didn't even care who was there. They just started passing him up, and then Rockefeller would start whipping his horse until he was able to overtake the other guy. So he couldn't let anyone beat him at anything. He was extremely religious, and he did hire Reverend Frederick Gates to help him start his medical establishment, his medical trust. And they changed their whole philosophies from philanthropy to corporate and profit and monopolies and such, but we'll go over that. So Rockefeller was really good at manipulating other people to get what he wanted. During the time when he was running Standard Oil, he started a rumor because he wanted to be able to buy out all the other refineries in the area. And so he started a rumor that there was a company that was going to come in and cause a lot of problems for all the refinery makers, and they were going to have to do all this extra stuff, and that it would be better if these other people just sold their refineries to him. And he had offered to buy the refineries at a lower price. So he called it the Southern Improvement Company. He claimed it was the railroads that had come up with the idea of the SIC to increase their profits, and that he had really had no choice but to enter into the agreement. He did not invite Payne, this one refinery owner, to join the SIC. Instead, he offered to buy out Payne's refinery at a very nice price, to give Payne a hefty amount of Standard Oil stock that would certainly mint him a fortune and bring him in as a high-level executive with an illustrious title. He would make far more money this way than by trying to compete with Standard Oil. So he's using this to try to rattle the other refinery owners and get them to sell him their refineries, because he couldn't stand to lose. Another thing he did was he would buy up all the real estate around the other businesses that he was trying to acquire, so that they couldn't expand. And there were a lot of people, because of Rockefeller's tactics that he used, there was a lot of businessmen who would not deal with Rockefeller. They wouldn't sell him things, they wouldn't buy things from him. So what he would do is set up these shadow companies. And they were still owned by him, but nobody knew they were owned by him. So he could actually still interact with these companies and get a better bargain than he would knowing that if they knew that they were working with him. So either way, he always won. He always got what he wanted. He did anything to get what he wanted. He was aggressive. He would lie, cheat, and manipulate. And thus, by the time in the 1900s, he was the wealthiest man. And Robert Greene says he was the first billionaire on the planet. So now we're going to look at, that was this book. Now we're going to look at The Medical Trust by E. Robert Brown. And I got this book pretty cheap on Amazon, but you can get a free copy online. You could just search Rockefeller Medicine Man, PDF. Okay, this book talks about Rockefeller setting up a medical trust and calling it philanthropy. He always appeared nice and sweet and kind in person, but behind the scenes, he was ready to stab you in the back. And he always had ulterior motives, and that motive was to make money. Here's some background information. The railroad led the way for many businessmen to their pots of gold. Rockefeller owned a shipping company, and during the Civil War was able to use the railroads as cheap shipping method for his products, because Lincoln used the military to take over the rail lines, and Rockefeller was able to obtain cheap shipping for his products, which led him to make even more money. J.D. Rockefeller, as being helped by the war, made a fortune. In 1861, the war consumed the energies and lives of both the North and the South. Rockefeller established a successful merchandising firm in Cleveland. Rockefeller made tons of money, and by 1880, made tons more money through his Standard Oil Company, refining about 95% of the country's oil. And we already learned about the tactics he used to become the number one the number one oil company. He gave money to the political candidates close to his oil company's field of operations, so that there were other oil people or people familiar with oil who benefited from oil getting elected as politicians. And then Rockefeller meets Reverend Franklin Taylor Gates. And Reverend Franklin Taylor Gates introduced Rockefeller to something called wholesale philanthropy. This is a money-making scheme that looks like philanthropy. The Gates of our time, Bill Gates, was related to Rockefeller through John D. Rockefeller's grandfather, or John D. Rockefeller was the grandfather of Nelson Rockefeller, who was the 41st president, and Reverend Gates and Bill Gates are cousins, so many cousins, you know, and then removed so many times, but they were related to Franklin, or to John D. Rockefeller, and they've been clustered together ever since. So Reverend Gates first suggested to give Baptist agencies a cut of money instead of individual churches. So Rockefeller had a history of giving to individual churches large sums of money. And that was his philanthropy. Giving back to the community was one of the ways he was doing it, was to give a lot of money to individual churches. Well, Reverend Gates came along and he said, no, let's not do that anymore. Instead, let's create a Baptist agency. Well, Baptist agency is not a church. So they now are making the individuals who need money or help from their church go to the agency called a denomination board to bring the flocks in. So now they have sort of an audience or a group of people which they can sell to. Because remember, now they're selling their medicine ideas. So in 1916, Gates began converting all his investments into then rising and profitable bank stocks and encouraged Rockefeller to do the same, recommending especially Chase National Bank, probably another relative, which was paying dividends of 20% on invested capital. So now I'm going to turn to page 43. Let's see. The programs and strategies that emerged from this center of financial power had an enormous impact, especially on medical care and health systems in the United States and throughout the world. Having acquired the fortune, it fell to Rockefeller and his associates to maintain it as a trust for the people, just as Carnegie had advocated. It is the duty of men of means, Rockefeller wrote early in this century. Now, remember, he maintains a facade of being just this nice, great, wonderful man. But deep down, he's manipulating, he's cutthroat, he's aggressive. He'll do whatever he has to do to make his money. So to maintain the title to their property and to administer their funds until some man or body of men shall rise up capable of administrating for the general good the capital of the country better than they can. So they're saying that they should be able to run everyone's lives and their property until somebody else steps up to do it. So Rockefeller was given money to the universities to create laboratories and research libraries and all these other things, but came with stipulations. And these stipulations included a license. So you couldn't just graduate, you had to get a license. And then later on it came to specialties. Now you had to get a specialty. And then later on after that, surgeons. Now you have to get, more education and another license to become a surgeon. And all this was done, says Rockefeller, to create, or says the writer, Richard Brown, to create jobs for wealthy people's children. And this was the creation of a middle class. So this middle class of people were controlled by Rockefeller using this medical trust and giving money to the universities in order to put requirements on who could get a license. And of course also the schools are expensive, so you have to have a lot of money to be able to send your kids to these schools. Okay, so the license allowed for the control of the number of doctors in an area, which kept the doctors in high demand, allowing them to make enough money to be considered the middle class. Only the wealthy could afford to send their children to these universities. Eventually, the money given to schools came with various stipulations, such as the requirement to obtain a license, only allowing so many graduates per year, and then they had to get specialties, and then later on they could become surgeons. Another reason why this was done was to push out the sectarian doctors or natural homeopathic doctors, and to turn medicine from an art and a humanitarian thing into a money-making scheme that made Rockefeller even more money. So the medical establishment created by him waged a type of war against natural doctors. Later on, then, he was part of the creation of the American Medical Association, the AMA. Okay, so now I have notes on page 70. And my whole point in this is really to try to get people to read some of these books, because there's a wealth of knowledge in these books. And I think that if people just take the time to just read a little, they'll be amazed at what they realize they didn't know. So the history of medicine from this perspective can be understood as a political process in which specific reforms, however much they may increase the technical effectiveness of physicians, are also instruments of persuasion and symbols of legitimacy. And we'll find out later on that they use this power to talk negatively about the homeopathic medicine. And when you say something negative, people are so funny. When you say something negative about something, people don't stop and think about, well, I wonder if that's true or if that's not true. They just hear it and they think, oh, that's true then. So I must believe that. It must be true because these great and wonderful gods of medicine are saying it's true. So homeopathy must be bad and science must be great. And it's not really the case. The goals of reform leaders were to gain collective control for the profession over its working conditions and economics in order to establish a hierarchy of authority, something that Ron Paul talks about all the time, this authority. We need to get rid of the authoritarians. A hierarchy of authority and power among healing occupations to assure that physicians reign firmly at the top of the hierarchy and to assure them as high incomes as possible in any given historical period. And then what do we have now? The requirement to have insurance, which just increases the prices even more. I went to an ENT probably a year ago, and he charged $1,600 an hour. I was in there for about 15 minutes. So that bill was high. Page 70. It was medical science that provided the key to professional reform. Medical research yielded new tools of understanding and held out the hope of more effective techniques of prevention and treatment than orthodox medicine offered. But scientific medicine was utilized by professional leaders beyond merely increasing the effectiveness of their practice. It became as well the ideology of professionalism, used to gain support from the dominant groups associated with industrial capitalism, to cement the complete dominance of healthcare by the medical profession, and to raise the incomes and status of physicians as a group. So here he's explaining to you that the takeover of our historical medicine as an art was done to create a middle class for the children of the wealthy and to create money, capitalism. It was looked at as a way to make money. Medicine should not be a way to make money, in my opinion. Okay, so they called it the new middle class. And let's go to page 77. Government officials and philanthropists saw little value in researching human disease, as Richard Shryock notes, partly because of the nature of medical science prior to 1885, and partly because human welfare brought no direct financial return. Let's see. They portrayed medicine as an exact science. Even if it's called a science, it's not an exact science. They even portray politics as a science, and it's not an exact science either. Okay, so scientific medicine thereby supported the claims of the profession for a monopoly of control over all healing methods. These benefits provided the basis for other gains and were effective in undermining sectarian medicine, midwifery, and other forms of competition. So we know Rockefeller used various tactics to get the other refinery owners to sell him their refineries. So he's kind of using these same sort of tactics with Gates' help in medicine. And for one thing that you can live without, maybe okay, but medicine, I think, should just be off limits, especially now when they want to vaccinate us and our children, making us sick. Many quacks had effective cures. Many so-called quacks, that Rockefeller would call quacks, had effective cures where science had failed, Billings admitted. But rather than giving him pause in his rejection of any scientific medical methods, Billings saw it as a tactical problem of persuading the American public that it is in their interest to suppress quackery. The reformers believed scientific medicine would increase the technical effectiveness of the medical profession, and they promoted it as the only effective therapeutic method. So come see us and give us your money and nobody else, because those people are quacks, even though they had admittedly effective cures. Now page 125. Gates, Reverend Gates, what's his name? Franklin Taylor Gates, who started Rockefeller's trust, his medical trust, who originally started as a really religious man who maybe was trying to do the right thing, has been converted now into a capitalist. So Gates found himself converted from baptism to capitalism and scientism. It's making a lot of money. Why not? That medicine must intervene in political and social life. It must point out the hindrances that impede the normal functioning of vital processes and affect their removal. So now they're saying, let's get medicine into government. And that's what they did, because now pretend government, not the constitutional government, but the business government now requires doctors, in order to practice in the United States, to have a medical license. Hospitals have to be registered if they want to say that they're practicing in the United States. Okay, so they need governments to help to convert people from the real natural health to the money-making scheme of medical science, created by Rockefeller's trust. Each major medical interest group is represented by a bill in Congress. This is page 216. The AMA, the insurance industry, and the American Hospital Association have all submitted bills that would favor their members. The legislation that emerges from this process will undoubtedly favor the medical market and enhance the capital-intensive sector of the system. Okay, so I really encourage people to read this book, Rockefeller Medicine Men, if you want to know more about Rockefeller and how he's using science or medical science to promote his monopoly over medicine. And then if you just happen to want to read a really good book, I really like this book, The Laws of Human Nature by Robert Greene. And he talks about a lot of people in here, some of them famous, some of them not, and their personalities and the things they went through in life to get where they are. There's a fashion designer in here. There's some people that were just authors back, you know, a long time ago. Rockefeller's in here. He's got Nixon in here, and he analyzes their personalities and tells you a lot about their type, which Carl Jung would call an archetype. And I think it was Plotinus. Anyway, one of those old philosophers who came up with an education system. And one of the biggest parts of the education system was fighting, learning to fight, learning to handle yourself in battle. But bigger than that was understanding people, understanding how they think, how they're going to act, what they're going to do next. Once you can understand their personalities, which Carl Jung would call an archetype, you'll know how to fight them and win. And Rockefeller always won, but he was the aggressive type. So if you want to know more about the medical establishment and how Rockefeller used it, and how it's become such a big part of government, and how you think that they're forcing us to use this system, they're not really. If you want to know more about that, see my video on positive laws, and there's one on and off federal lands. It's really important to understand this stuff. And if you understand this stuff, it's going to really change the way you see our government and how it's perpetuating its authority, so-called authority over us, authority it doesn't really have. So I'd appreciate it if you would share the videos, because there's a lot of people out there who want this information and don't have it, and they want to learn, and they want to know what books to read. And so far I've been kicked off Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, which I don't know why I was kicked off Instagram, because I never really even used it. But this is my one last platform. So read these books, and if you read them, let me know how you liked it, and share it with other people. Maybe do your own video and talk about the things you learned, and just get the word out, because a lot of people need help right now. Have a good day.